play the game of pen and paper Mastermind, first, set up the game. To do this, first give each player a sheet of paper and a writing utensil. At the top of the page, each player will draw 4 connected boxes. Next to this, write Guess 1. Make 9 more of these, increasing the guess number by 1 each time. Next to each of these, make another smaller version of the 4 connected boxes. Above these boxes, write correct guesses. On the bottom right corner of the page, write My Code, and make another 4 boxes that look like the guess boxes above. Next, make a key on the bottom right corner of the paper. X will represent the correct number and position, and O will represent just the correct number. After both players have created their game sheets, they are ready to start playing the game. The game of pen and paper Mastermind is a game where one player is trying to make a code and the other player is trying to break that code. The code maker tries to make a code that will stump the other player, and the code breaker gets 10 chances to try to break that code. With each guess, they will get hints from the code maker. To start the game, one player will be named as the first code maker, and the other player will be named as the first code breaker. The code maker, as the name implies, will make the code. The code maker will make a code using numbers 1 through 6. They can make any combination using these numbers. While making their code, they are allowed to repeat numbers. And they could even repeat all of the same number, so this would be allowed. The goal of the code maker is to produce a code that they think will be difficult for the code breaker to guess. After deciding on a 4-digit code, the player will write the code in the My Code section on the bottom of their sheet, and keep their sheet hidden from their opponent. If players don't wish to use numbers for the game, they can use colors instead. The code maker can choose from different colors and put colors in the boxes instead of numbers. Players can also use other things like shapes or letters to create their code if they wish. After the code has been created, the code breaker will begin their task of trying to break their code. The code breaker will start by making their first guess as to what their opponent's code could be. They may guess using any number from 1 to 6, and the numbers may be repeated. To make their guess, they will write their 4-digit guess on the Guess 1 line, with 1 digit per box. After the code breaker makes their guess, they will pass their paper to the code maker. The code maker will keep their code secret, but they will check to see if the code breaker correctly guessed their code. To do this, they will compare their code to the code breaker's first guess. If the code breaker guessed their code right away, the round will be over. Most likely, they will not guess it, so the code maker will let them know if any part of their guess was correct. First, they will look to see if any of the digits of the code breaker's guess matched both the correct number and the correct position in their code. In this case, the 4 of the code breaker's guess was the correct number and it was in the correct position in the code. As the key shows, they would indicate this with an X. Next, they would check to see which numbers from the guess are not in the correct position, but are the correct number in the code. So in this case, the 3 was a correct number guess, but it was not guessed in the right position in the code. The 1 was also a correct number guess, but not in the right position. As the key shows, they would indicate these numbers with an O. The code maker will place these symbols in the correct guesses boxes, next to that guess on the code breaker's sheet. The code maker does not have to put these guesses in any particular order, so they can mix up the order of the symbols to try to throw off their opponent. They must, however, make sure that they accurately indicate all of the matching elements between their code and their opponent's code. After indicating the correct guesses, the code maker will pass the code breaker's sheet back to them. The code breaker will use the information they gained from the code maker about their first guess to make another guess as to what the code might be. They will write their next guess in the Guess 2 boxes. After making their guess, they will pass their sheet back to the code maker. The code maker will compare the code breaker's second guess to their code, just as they did with the first guess. Once again, they will indicate numbers that are in the correct position of the code with an X, and those that are just the correct number with an O. So in this case, this 1 is in the correct position, so this would be indicated with an X. No other numbers are correct, so the codemaker would put a single X on the codebreaker's sheet, next to guess 2, and pass the sheet back to the codebreaker. The codebreaker will continue to make guesses in this way, and will continue to get feedback on their guesses from the codemaker. As the codebreaker guesses, they will be able to learn things about the code. For example, by guess 3, this codebreaker knows that there is no 2 in the codemaker's code. They know this because their first guess told them that 3 of the 4 numbers they guessed were in the code. Their second guess of all 1s told them that a single 1 was definitely in the code. The third guess told them that there was no 2 in the code because they still had only one correct number, which was the 1. Players can use both the numbers they know to be in the code and those they know not to be in the code to help them crack their opponent's code. They will continue to guess until they either guess the correct code or use all of their possible guesses without guessing correctly. So in this example, this player guessed the code in 6 guesses. In this example, the player did not correctly guess the code in 10 guesses. After the code has either been guessed or the player failed to guess it within the 10 guess limit, the round is over. After a round of the game ends, the codebreaker will get a chance to look at the code sheet and examine it for errors. They will look at the correct guesses section of their paper and make sure the codemaker didn't give them any information that was not true during the round. If they do find information that is incorrect, they will immediately score 3 points, and the round will be played over. The player gets the points because if they were told improper information, it could have affected the way they guessed. For example, let's say this codebreaker ended the round and examined their sheet. They now know that the codemaker's code was 3154. As they examined their sheet, they noticed that on their first guess, the codemaker told them they had one correct number and one correct number in the correct position. They actually had 2 correct numbers and 1 correct number in the correct position. So the codemaker missed an O in the correct guess's space. Therefore, the codebreaker was given incorrect information about their code. They would immediately score 3 points, and that round would be played over. It should be noted that if there are multiple mistakes, they do not score 3 points per mistake. They only score a single 3-point bonus, and that round would be played over. The current codemaker would have to make a new code, and the codebreaker would get a chance to crack the code again. If everything looks correct to the codebreaker, the codemaker and the codebreaker will switch roles. The new codemaker will create a new code, and the new codebreaker will try to break the code. After both players have taken a turn as both the codemaker and the codebreaker, the game is over. Each player will score points based on how many guesses the other player took to guess their code. So in this game, the yellow player would score 6 points, because it took the red player 6 guesses to guess their code. If the codemaker makes a code that the other player fails to solve, they will score 10 points, 1 for each guess. They will also score 1 bonus point for stumping their opponent, for a total of 11 points. As mentioned earlier, if a codemaker fails to give the codebreaker correct information about their code guess, and the codebreaker catches their error at the end of the round, the codebreaker scores 3 bonus points. If this occurred during the game, the 3 points will be added to that player's total points. The player who ends the game with the most points is the winner.